and welcome to VarnVlog, and I'm here with Nadim of 99 Eins. I'm gonna fuck that up in German.
99:1.
Yeah, it's like I know how to say that, but I don't.
Yeah, you've been in Germany. I mean,
yeah, I've been in Germany. I can count. But so we were talking off air, and we've been talking since a couple of interviews you did a few weeks ago about the socialists who have looked at the legacy of Karl Kautsky and decided that electoralism, and specifically what I would call positive electoralism, the abandonment of the original SPD stance in the early 20th century, which is don't form coalitions with bourgeois governments and vote, basically being negationist in your electoralism, but not actually trying to launch a platform unless you could actually launch it on your own power, which of course kind of infamously during the Weimar period the SPD gives up, and I'm sure your listeners probably know this history better than my listeners because it's their history as opposed to something that we fetishize. But as my friend Dan Hilton said the other day, it's the nature of American leftism that they read histories of Weimar Germany and think to themselves, if only we had a party as good as the 1920s SPD to vote for.
Yeah, because that went well.
Yeah, it's just like, I'm like, that's you guys know how this ends, right? I mean,
that's the one thing that I agree with the Platypus guys on. They have this one line where they're like, yeah, all our heroes, Lenin, Luxembourg, all these guys, Kautsky, even the big fighters of history, they have all lost. We got to be better than them. We got to have something else up our sleeves. Won't work like that.
Yeah, and I think the specifics of that are quite important to understand. And your show is great for getting a better feel for what's going on in Europe and the Middle East, as long as you speak German, or at least understand German. And Nadim, you might get a kick out of this. I use your show to make sure that I haven't lost my German. like, can I still understand this?
Yeah. No, it depends. If you're hanging out through the 4 hours of our monthly episode, where we get also a little bit hammered.
No, I don't understand all that.
And you can understand all that, then you're good.
So here in the United States, we're kind of in a lull. The DSA is claiming it has 95K members, but its internal NPC reports indicates it's actually that between 12 and 20K of that is inactive, meaning they're not paying dues, and reports on the ground from the chapters is they don't have enough people actually showing up, even if they are still paying dues, to hold quorum to have local chapters actually do business. But there has been a successful parliamentary movement around the DSA as a faction of the Democratic Party at the state level in New York and to a lesser degree in California. And there's been the whole development of the Squad, which are 6 Democratic senators who
have amazing PR.
Yeah, have amazing PR. Are always on left-wing shows, have some relationship formally to the DSA, whether it's endorsement or membership, and yet every time they do something that is explicitly against the DSA platform, the DSA blocks down on doing much else other than censoring them. And part of this, I think, there's a lot of calls to expel them from the DSA and whatever. And I've gone, yeah, I get that, and you probably should, but what is it going to do? Because what this shows me is the endorsement of the DSA is is part of branding, but they don't, despite the fact that they give candidates money. In fact, I pointed out to someone that of their operating budget that isn't spent on just maintaining the organization and its own legal protections and stuff like that, which is it's a lot of money that goes into that they spend money on electoralism, which in the United States is ungodly expensive. And the DSA actually can't do it very well because they are transparent with their books. They do use their fees, their dues, actually, pretty honestly. But they can give a candidate running in a local race $5,000 to help them out. And I find that hilarious because I know that even in my borough of Salt Lake, or my district in Salt Lake City, a city councilman seat can take in an election several $100,000 to run in part of a mid-sized city. So what the DSA can do doesn't make a lot of sense. Like I don't understand even why they are doing it as a cost to benefit analysis, because they're not helping the candidates enough to really help them, and their withdrawal doesn't really hurt the candidates either. So as a parliamentary tactic, it seems absurd, and it's really come to a head as the quote most pro-labor president since FDR, unquote. Which I also think is a ludicrous claim, but Joe Biden.
I mean, maybe it's a true claim, but it still might not mean much. I mean,
yeah, it's well, one, Bus Carson Carr has gone on record as saying that Joe Biden is the most left-wing president we've had since FDR, and that's a sad state of affairs. So I want to emphasize his second part. He's not dumb. But I've even said, I don't even think that's true. I think Lyndon Baines Johnson was actually more progressive on labor policy on poverty stuff than Joe Biden. He was just a warmonger and an anti-communist. So we have to not deal with that contradiction. And in some ways, Eisenhower was as progressive as Joe Biden, but it's easy to be progressive when he's giving lip service to things, and the NCLB board is helping new unions form and Starbucks and Amazon. But as I've been pointing out, in the United States, the old unions are not growing. In fact, they shrunk during COVID. And so this great rebirth of labor in America, which I don't think is entirely false, but it's not in official uniondom, except in areas that are already unionized, in areas that are structurally hard for those unions to do a lot, because you have unions whose shop contracts are for 30 people at a time in the case of Starbucks, right? So there's no, each site's going to have different contracts. Each site's going to have a different union negotiation team. And structurally speaking, that's very hard to deal with. Now, for people in Europe, when I explain this, they're always like, "What?" I'm like, "Yes, that's how unions work in America. Right. There's legal reasons for it."
Right.
But on top of all that, most American unionized workers are not actually under the National Labor Relations Act passed by FDR. State unions, federal government unions, teachers unions, nurses unions, and the railroad are all governed by different laws. We don't have rights to the NCLB board. For those of you in Europe, that's the National Labor Relations Board that oversees whether or not there's strike breaking. In most southern and Midwestern states, outside of the upper Midwest, teachers and nurses can no longer strike. And in the South, they can't even call themselves a union legally. So it's, well, I shouldn't say all the South. It depends on the state, but you have 50 different laws. Okay. You've had someone on your show who is advocating a return to Kauskian parliamentarism.
Right.
And as fractured as what I'm describing with our labor law is, our election laws are also state run by our Constitution. The only time the federal government can really intervene is if a state is seen as violating civil rights. Otherwise, the states can run the elections the way they see fit. So there's 50 different sets of election laws. And I don't think that's understood in Europe a lot of the times. Like, I talk to Europeans and they're like, you Americans all think, and I'm like, no, actually, I don't think you understand how our system works.
Mm-hmm.
Like our states are barely part of, I mean, like, they have a level of legal sovereignty that, say, provinces in most European countries do not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have 50 different sets of criminal law. We have the different federal courts adjudication of common law, which is the law that we inherited from Great Britain from like the medieval period that we still use. Have completely different presidents in different regions of the country, and that's why they have to be reconciled by the Supreme Court. It is a system that is incredibly complicated. And the socialist impulse in America has been start at the federal level and in fact, start with the president. Which,
right.
When I'm describing these complications to you, is trying to bypass the fact that this is an overcomplicated system that they can't navigate. And also, there's a way in which the tail is wagging the dog, where there's this circular logic that's been articulated, even by people I respect, like Adolf Reed, where if we push a presidential figure who shows that maybe the left can get close to winning, that it will create the workers' movement we need for the left to win. But you can see that this is circular, because you also need that workers' movement to kind of already exist for Bernie Sanders to even get really close. And so you have a kind of cul-de-sac strategy. And that's where we've been. Since Biden won, there's been calls, to like redraft Bernie in 2024 out of DSA people, but Bernie's over 80 years old. I mean, I don't want to sound ageist, but there's a good chance he would not survive multiple terms as president. But there's also a very good chance that he would also get nothing done, because he would be hemmed in by both a hostile Supreme Court and a party that doesn't really support his reforms.
And what's the strategy for that thing then backfiring?
They don't have one.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, now you have your socialist president, you have your socialist people in there that can drive the policy, and of course they will be obstructed every inch of the way.
Right.
And now everybody's going to say, okay, look. I mean, that's the thing that I think with all these discussions, I mean, one can get lost in so many details, but ultimately what I realize also when having these discussions in Germany with people that really believe in this interest strategy of, we're undermining the bourgeois democracy by sending a couple of people in there, like a cancer or something. they always, like, what is lacking is really an understanding of what is the state, what are these parties, what's the parliament for, what is its function, and it's really like an affirmation of bourgeois ideals of that. So our parliament is something that is basically like a pluralist body. We just need to have the right people in there, and if we vote the correct way, then it will turn out, it will open the possibilities for socialism. I think that's already the first mistake. And the second mistake that I would just hear from what you just explained, this circle of, or this idea, that once we win a little bit here and there, people believe that the left can win something and then they will come with us. It presupposes that the only obstacle and the only problem
is voters.
That the only problem of the left, not gaining any voters, is that they don't believe that we can win. Well, I think that already presupposes that, on the level of critique, they are already with you. They're already on board. They already accept that, capitalism is crap. We have to get rid of it. But they just don't believe that you can win, and that's why they go with Biden. I think that's completely ludicrous. And I think that's what communists should be working on helping people understand what these terms are and how these things function, rather than, putting the right people in the parliament.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I have thought a couple of things about that. And when you ask everyone from Noam Chomsky, you know, not a socialist, well, being kind of a socialist, but, you know,
libertarian socialist. No,
yeah, libertarian socialist, a term that I think is ridiculous, but people like not. It's not that I necessarily think we need to be authoritarian socialists. I'm just like, it's either redundant or
it's
dumb.
a protest form. It's
right?
I mean, yeah, it's a protest term. Yeah,
right. And protesting against what? I mean, like
against. I mean, it's trying to disassociate yourself from what you saw as the authoritarian socialists and the Soviet Union, Stalin, etc.
Right.
That's what that is.
Yeah. Yeah. And so far, what I can tell in America amongst political dissidents, it's only made Stalinism look cooler.
Exactly.
So, I mean, actually, a whole different conversation, but American anti-communism plus the left opposition being so stymied and being so dominant in the U.S. actually is why, if somebody wants to show that they are different from the democratic social democrats, I don't know why they think flipping the words makes a difference. It's a real, that's even a stranger bit of branding. So
we could make a whole episode about that.
But if you want to differentiate yourself from that and you don't want to be seen as someone totally alienated from politics, you will move over to Marxist-Leninism, which of course you will have no effect in America on anything when you do that.
And then you have nearly close to zero good analyses.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And you just start talking about nation states in that capital. Like, it's very odd.
And the monopoly capitalists and
pretending that we're still under Fordism in America and classical social democracy of the Keynesian type in Europe. It just doesn't hold water. So yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And why I'm torn about it, though, there is a sense in which in the United States, the reason why progressives don't seem to get support is that people don't trust them to enact the policies they say, because their policies are popular to some degree. Like honestly, in places that are less run by Democrats, many things that are on a social democratic agenda are actually more popular than they are in heavily democratic states. The issue, however, is one, assuming that means an opposition to capitalism, because no one's ever said that.
Yeah. But that's already a huge problem, I think. I mean, look, even just, you know, caring in the situation that we are in, and I speak for Germany, I don't speak for the US. Maybe it's better or worse there, I don't know, whatever. But like talking in this situation about how to gain voters is for me already like 25 steps ahead.
Right.
I mean, when I talk to people from the left party, and I'm not even talking about the Greens or the SPD, which are fairly neoliberal capitalist parties by now, bourgeois parties. Let's talk with left-wing people that even, you know, on their slogans, they put stuff like capitalism kills or stuff like that. No? Mm. And you talk with them a little bit about what they understand capitalism to be or what the state is. You get nothing back, and ultimately what you have very strong are all these social demands, let's say, and I mean that's fair, right? We need a minimum wage, we need a higher minimum wage, we need some, I don't know, we need some support because of the inflation right now, etc., etc. And that's all nice and good, and I'm not against that, but that is actually part of the bourgeois politics. We as communists, we should come from another base. We could still maybe engage in those. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying our base should be that we want to get rid of this stuff. We want to burn the whole thing down. Right. And I mean, if I'm talking to people here, like even the most left radical, I mean, some of the most radical acting people, they don't have that mindset. They don't have that understanding even that, you know, certain things cannot stay the way that they are. Certain things have to really end at some point, and we need to build towards that. And that's why I'm always saying, like, I'm really getting on this train where I'm insisting on people just shutting up and reading their books again. because I mean, if you don't understand how this stuff works and why parties are doing what they're doing, yeah, you can, of course, you can demand a higher wage. And to be honest, the people will do that also without communists in those groups. They will do that anyway. That's not what the communists are there for. Communists are therefore to tell them that demanding a higher wage is nice and good, but the reason why you have to demand this is because the system is geared against you, and that's why you want to get rid of the system. And who really? I mean, let's not even talk about publicly, but maybe you have talked to some of those DSA guys in person. Maybe like you have other experiences there, but for me in Germany, barely anyone is on that on that train with me.
Most communists aren't.
Right.
I mean,
right. I mean, it's social democracy now, and then we can see later, right? So
right. I mean, like the Marxist-Leninist parties in America are actually, if you look at their policies, for example, what they want different things on geopolitics. They might want a multipolar world. I don't understand why communists are taking 19th and 20th century English geopolitics as a given, because it comes from some people in Russia right now. I mean, I was like, let's talk about what multipolarity actually is about, what it indicates and what it says, because it's a communist. It's a change of situation, but it is more volatile, and it has no promise of being more progressive. And when they're like, it's anti-imperialism, like, no, multipolarity explicitly is multiple imperialisms as opposed to one.
And that's already, yeah, they already get wrong what imperialism is in the first place. Imperialism for them is a moral judgment. It's like, right, yeah, the US is doing imperialism, no one else is doing it. Nobody else. Nation states have power inside of their borders, and they try to extend that power outside of their borders, and then they clash with other nation states. And when they have some more power than other states, they use that power. And ultimately, that's what imperialism then turns out to be.
Right.
And of course, yeah,
imperialism is inevitable. Well, actually, I would go so far as to say, as long as there are nation states, imperialism is inevitable.
Yeah. That's why even I would say, there is this idea that Lenin, with his imperialism as the last stage, he added something to capital, and I'm like, no, you didn't add anything on top. Like, all of this is perfectly explainable with 3 books. At least on a categorical level, we can explain this stuff. The form of it will look different from. I mean, okay, multipolarity. 1910, we had multipolarity. Was it great? I don't know.
Right. Well, I think this is a larger problem. I don't know if I'm going to answer your question. Yes. Although, on having met a lot of people in the DSA, I have had dinner with some of them. I've talked to some of them. There's a strange milieu there. One, we are also beginning to have millionaires in our ranks, some of whom we have made millionaires. I'm not going to name names, but you could look it up. There are key media figures. And 2, there's a strategy of patience that, someone like Ben Burgess, who's a close friend of mine, who thinks that I do think he wants to get rid of capitalism. I don't think what he wants to do is actually getting rid of capitalism, but that's a separate thing. But he does want radically, a system of co-ops. He wants workers to control them. He wants a completely different parliamentary system. And then he has this other strategy, which is the incremental, well, we got to do this, we got to do this, but it's all focused on like national policy. And the reason why I went through all that boring stuff in the beginning about the stuff in U.S. law is because I'm going to tell you, not only did most of the German listeners not know this, most Americans don't seem to know it either. They don't seem to understand the legal context in which they are operating.
Sure.
And so they'll call for things like, we need to abolish the Senate. And I'm like, well, how are you going to do that when you have to do 50 different states and you're starting at the national level, you're not going in at the state level. And the states that you do go into, I don't know the German equivalent, but it would be like only focusing on Berlin as how to change the entire country. And
it's less than socialism in one country, basically.
Right. It's like socialism in
one district,
in like a couple of municipalities and maybe 2 states. It's interesting because they're the 2 richest states in the country, New York and California. And it's also interesting in that they are, from the standpoint of, if you understand international law, they're going to have underrepresentation per person on the national level because of the way our strange federation works. So focusing there doesn't even get you a lot of power for your individual voter. But I think when we talk about that, you're right. We're like 50 stages away from being able to talk about that, because as bad as things are in Europe, we never even had the fall.
Right.
Like,
right.
Our people got crushed and co-opted immediately.
Right. Then it's also like, again, where do you start from, right? So, because if you come from this discussion of, you know, what's now the best tactic to take for the next elections or the next big thing that's going to be decided, you're already coming, I think, from the wrong position, where the position should be like, ultimately where you want to come from is you want to have, like, I don't know, you're meeting 1 or 2 people and you guys realize something is wrong here, and then you read and then you realize, okay, we know now why this is wrong. Now we need to teach more people why this is wrong. And then you build a movement that wants to burn the whole place down. And then at some point, when the movement becomes that strong and big, then maybe you will even be able to win some votes here and there. But then it's also clear that you winning the votes is not what tipped the power. It's just an expression of what you've already done before.
Yeah.
And so this is not a plaidoyer, like a call for complete inaction and, you know, complete retreat. But Ben Burgess, for example, right? So if he advocates worker co-ops, and then I heard sometimes talking about market socialism, there's also a lot, you know, you hear this a lot from the Jacobin guys. Me as a communist, I would immediately say, well, you already got your categories wrong. We need to talk about, you know, value and what that, like, how that works, and money, and why we need to get rid of it. And if you don't have that as a base, like a movement that has that as a common understanding, where are you going to go? You are going to end up in some kind of social democratic co-optable, thereby co-optable movement. And I can totally understand it in the US, yeah, because I mean, here in Germany we have quite a, you know, quite strong still, but diminishing welfare state and protections. And, you know, when I talk to my American family, they are jealous how much holidays we get, and, you know, how we are treated when we get sick, etc., etc., etc. Okay, I get that the situation is really bad for most people over there, right? I'm just saying that the struggle for communism is not, I mean, as bad as it sounds, as cynical as it sounds, it's not to improve that situation immediately. It's not to go into elections and improve it. It's to understand why this situation is as bad, what are the systemic reasons for that, and then getting rid of that system. And that's where I think then ultimately one can stop most of the discussions that I have. One can stop at this point, because there you already have a like fundamental disagreement, and you say, like, the moment you say that, you know, I want to get rid of money, people already, like, they get scared shitless. They don't understand what that means.
Right.
And it all sounds very, I get that it all sounds very theoretical, and, you know, immediately the accusation will come, oh, but this is not practice. How are you going to put this into practice? But I'm like every practice is informed by some kind of theory. Everything you do is informed by some kind of assumption about how the world works. There is nothing you do that is just practice. And there's also nothing you do that is just theory. So taking apart these two things is already wrong. And I think we're just at the point, you know, why did this guy 150 years ago write these books? Here, because he thought this is the most important thing that he can do for the working movements of his time, and because he was actually fucking angry at them all the time, and he was cursing at them. We have these 40 books, the collected works of Marx. 60-70% of them are just letters of him bitching to people in the workers' movement because he was angry at their positions, you know. And if you want to learn of history, I think that's how you should go. You should try to understand, okay, what is it that we're dealing with? And basically stop everything else.
I mean, this
as
is
bad as it sounds.
The funny thing. When I meet people who take Marxist history seriously, they talk about the program, and I get that, and the program's important. But when you start talking about value theory, their eyes glaze over because that's not immediately political in the way they think.
Right.
And that's why I'm like, well, that's why you guys go immediately from you. In fact, when you one of the things about American Marxists, regardless, very few of them quote Marx, except for like 3 key quotes.
Yeah,
they quote Kautsky, they quote Lenin, they quote Mao, and there are reasons to do all of that. But one of the things I will say is none of those people dealt with money as a contradiction. And when you hear, for example, a lot of people in the DSA, and I'm not going to call out any particular names on this, but they will say, well, the problem with capitalism is that free labor and having bosses and accumulating the labor is coercive. And I'm like, no, the problem is inherently in the exchange system. Labor is valorized in a certain way. And we could talk about yes, those Marxists who get into the nitty-gritty of this do not agree precisely on what value actually is.
Sure. Yeah.
We don't think it's manifest in price exactly. And so how we measure it is often different. I actually often just use normal bourgeois bullshit, like looking at GDP, like, okay, GDP is like an aggregate of profits. It's not perfect. It's not really what we're talking about, but it's a close figure. And you can actually see that it mirrors what Marx describes would happen in developed capitalist economies. Not perfectly. Marxist accounting system is different, but it's pretty close. So how do you fix that? Well, you don't fix that by monetary schemes. And in fact,
and you also don't fix it by ownership in companies, by creating co-ops. You still have co-ops that will compete with each other, that are going to try to sell stuff to each other and trying to bid each other, negotiate each other down. And then you have exactly these coercive drives. Again, even if you have 100 CEOs in that company instead of 1 now, it won't change anything.
Actually, I said this to Ben once. Ben and I were talking, and he said, well, in co-ops, some co-ops are not going to be as successful even under socialist production, so we're going to need something like
the practical dimension of this is already like there. I mean, we can already stop there. Like, just try it. If co-ops are so great, just try and build one. Build a car co-op, please. Everybody, like, try it. Sit together and build a car co-op for like a high competitive, highly monopolized market. Try to go in there with a co-op. Let's see what happens.
Right.
You can do it for that Coca-Cola with that nice logo on top that you sell like, I don't know, 6,000 bottles a year. And then you have your co-op with your 5 people. Yeah, great. Or you have, what's the other one called in Spain?
Mondragon. Yeah,
Mondragon. And Mondragon, interestingly, every year when their business cycle goes down, or every couple of years, they have to buy in cheap labor, and they do not get any kind of benefits from the company as working in a co-op. None of this. It's just cheap labor.
I was about to say, like, they have to do that. And one of the things that I was going to talk to Ben's like, well, we would have to ameliorate that with a progressive income tax. And I'm like, if there is a progressive income tax, because income distributions are different in Marxist socialism for the same amount of work, right? I know that Marx criticizes paying everyone exactly their value because you have to generate social surplus. Right. Yeah. But if you think that you need a progressive income tax, you have already shown there is still exploitation in this system, because the progressive income tax has to be imposed by some government. And the people are not deciding how to use their surplus production. You know, I mean, and the reason why you have to use your surplus production is, yes, Marxists realize not everyone can work. Like, we know that. Like, we don't want to just let all the disabled people die. Like that's, I hear people say that about Marxists, and I'm like, no, it's in our primary text that we understand that. Like, So yes, and so you can't give people back exactly their value, but you can come pretty damn close, and you can organize society where people decide, everybody who works decides how that surplus is going to be allocated.
Okay.
And if you have income distributions and stuff, I mean, Marx actually says you shouldn't worry too much about that because it won't happen. But if you have income distribution differences, in that are of any significance that you would need a progressive income tax to fix, you've already proven you didn't actually figure out how to fix the problem, and you are replicating elements of capitalism. I mean, this gets even more, ludicrously, and this is why a lot of the people that we're talking about who are not social democrats, at least not in name, when they become like Dungist Maoist and are talking about how China is a socialist country, and I'm like, one, China doesn't even have most of the social goods as Europe. It's part of why zero COVID's going on is because they don't have a developed up healthcare sector.
Right.
And they don't have, in fact, their insurance system, even though they have state paid doctors, is very, very similar to the United States. Like, it's not even a European style. So even from your standpoint of moderate social democratic reforms, I don't see how it matters. But all you can cite is the state controlling shares in like 60% of corporations, but everything there is still exploitative. And it still integrates fine with the capitalist market. And if it was doing anything like communistically, it would not be integratable to the capitalist market, like definitionally. So, and so when I tell people this, their eyes just glaze over. So,
they stop listening. Exactly. It's like, okay, but if we can't have, and that's my point, if we can't have that conversation, then basically we're stuck on this. And I think we can't skip over this. If we don't understand, okay, if we don't understand money, if we don't understand how the state actually uses all its force and all its power and all its military and all its laws to establish that money is the way that each and every one of us gets their food. This is, and if we don't derive from this that our main enemy is the state, then we have a problem, right? If we are not agreeing with this, like you and me, or I don't know, 3 more people or something, we are in a group and we don't agree with this. We shouldn't move to practice from here. We should clear that up.
Yeah, this is funny when they talk about monopoly capital, because I agree with you that if you read, like, say, Lenin's pamphlet's a pamphlet, it doesn't go into much explanation, but reading Bukharin's imperialism book, which actually does work through it. Bukharin works out how the implications of state competition and the problems with declining rate of profits would lead to more and more state intervention, something that's actually implied by Engels and Marx themselves, as part of the mechanism that enables communists to take over the state, to dismantle it, because it will become more and more centralized. Now, that led to a lot of really bad mistakes in Germany in particular, but it is part of the logic, right?
Yeah, sure. It's happening right now. I mean, right now, the German state is intervening big time with, I don't know, 400 billion have been spent this year just on this Ukraine crisis. And now, they realize now, people are being squeezed a lot because of the gas prices and the inflation. So now we need to pump some money, and they're actually doing big time MMT right now. So we can see now in the next 2-3 years how that develops, because they are putting 200 more billion on the table just in order to support people and give them some money back. So of course the state is going to intervene. I mean, the oil and gas prices, this is not a market. They are basically negotiated by states, and it's a highly planned market. Let's say maybe it's a market, but it's a highly planned market. I don't think that this is contradictory, right?
Well, I don't think it's a contradictory at all. I've pointed out that from the standards of MMT, it's actually Republicans who do more of what they want, which is print money and not recoup the spending.
Sure. And the question would then be, here they are saying, for example, why don't we give more money to, I don't know, to unemployed if we can do MMT? Why don't we do that? Well, I would ask back, yes, why don't they do that? Give us an answer for that.
Exactly. Don't just say like, oh, it's their political ideology that means that they don't understand how it would be. And I'm like, okay, it's a decision, right? Sure. Well, I'm just going to go on power. Could it be that they would lose all their power if they gave us that ability? And we already see that that both the European Central Bank and the Fed are willing to wage war in a way that doesn't even make sense, to try to increase a small bit of unemployment at a time where neither Europe nor the United States has a lot of excess labor force.
All right.
Like, we don't have a lot of surplus,
right?
Quote, surplus population, unquote. And we're not gonna get it either. Like, so why would they be willing to destroy whole aspects of the capitalist economy? And I'm like, well, because class relations start breaking down if they don't.
Exactly.
And they can't have that. Like,
there is one theoretician, his name, I mean, I send you a couple of texts from some guys here in Germany. Mm-hmm. They also write in English. People should check them out, the Gegenstandpunkt. Mm-hmm. But there is another theoretician, also started anarchist and turned Marxist guy. He's called Johannes Agnoli. And he wrote about state and capital. And he actually tried to take that apart again, you know, the state monopoly thesis, trying to take the idea apart that capital just took control over the state. Mm-hmm. And basically what has been the standard assumption since Lenin for socialists in that time. And he shows that the state is more than that. He uses the word dialectics a lot in this text, to be fair. But the state has, on the one hand, of course, the responsibility for long-term accumulation and the setting up of conditions in which the own national capitalists can thrive. And to that end, the state will also go against the interests of their own capitalists on the short or the midterm easily. We see that now. The war in the Ukraine, it doesn't make any sense, 0 sense for German capital, right? We don't even have, we are sending a couple of weapons there, but we don't even make much money there, right? It's really, you can also see this in our discussions in Parliament. The capitalists, they're not happy about the situations, but they're getting a lot of tax cuts and other benefits now. So, but the other part is basically the state has to step in a function that capital cannot fulfill, which is capital is basically raping the population to get their surplus, to get their value. But capital cannot at the same time, just like practically and also financially, take care of their reproduction.
Yep.
Of making sure that they survive, that they come back to work, that they have a family that they can take care of, etc., such that capital grows over long term. And here is where the welfare state comes in and says, okay, I'm going to take care of that. And of course, there are occasionally, and these also happen, these huge disruptions where, I don't know, a worker movement stops everything and strikes, and then there is a huge problem for capital accumulation also. And then that's where the state also steps in order to accumulate, co-opt. And basically, that's kind of what unions are, right? I mean, that's why also I think the fetishization with unions, where I think in the US you have such a bad situation about the unions, I totally get it. But on the other hand, we should also see that, yeah, unions could be, just like a party, could be maybe a tool of a socialist movement, of a communist movement to overcome things. But they can just as well be completely, utterly reactionary.
Right.
And shut down everything, right?
And depending on what industry they're in, how they're organized, one of the things I find is very interesting that Europe and the United States, and I'm broadly speaking Europe, I know different European states have different trends, but is that the discrediting of the union movement happened in both places. And Americans don't realize that they're like, whoa, everyone in Norway loves the unions. And I'm like, a lot of people in Norway and Sweden see the unions as complicit with suppressing wages, operating with the state, and that led to a neoliberal turn. It led to a reactionary turn. But what they were observing was real. Like, it was formal policy.
Mm-hmm.
And so yes, it turned out that, yeah, that was better than what happened here. But in a lot of ways, I'm just like, it's not good enough. And if you've ever dealt with like formal union bureaucracy or whatever as an actual union member, and this is another thing about the DSA, as a lot of people when I ask people in the DSA if they're in unions, the answer is usually no. So while they're fetishizing unions, they don't even have access to them. And then they'll say, well, but only 7% of the U.S. workforce is unionized. And I'm like, yeah, but you're fetishizing something that you don't even really understand.
Where like are they even workers, or are they academics, or what? Like what's their main base? Like is there
it's actually so it's actually hard to tell. So anecdotally, I thought it was mostly students, but recent polls they've done actually do indicate that a lot of people are workers in the sense that they are wage earners, but they tend to be underemployed.
So part-time
gig, creative. They tend to live in progressive cities. And the unionization, like a lot of people who do the labor activism in the DSA, which there is a lot of, they are professional union organizers. They are not rank and file members of unions. There are rank and file members of unions in the DSA. I don't want people who are in the DSA to hear this think that I'm saying there isn't, but disproportionately from what I can tell from their stats, that's what it is. And I also want to point out that even though the DSA is huge, it is between 62 and 95,000 in a country of 350 million. The DSA is the size of a small Brooklyn neighborhood in the size of what its actual membership. And active membership and non-paper membership is going to be half to 1/4 of that. So, because to join the DSA, all you have to do is give them, pay the national dues. And if there's local dues, you can do that for a local chapter. And it doesn't even matter if you show up. Like, it's a very passive membership model. And then most of the activism that it does, and I have DSA people who will tell me they're like this is pride, it's volunteer work. And then I'm like, well, why aren't you in an NGO if that's what you wanted to do?
And their activism is mostly like electory stuff, or
that's what they spend money on. They do a lot of activism that's not electoral, but that's all volunteer.
Okay.
So, and I have said, like, what your organization spends money on is what it values.
Yeah, I mean, that's you're just attributing what you do in your free time to the DSA. Yeah, that's not...
right. And the DSA is asking you to donate it, and so I mean, it's not even the SPD or the left faction of the European Labour Party. I mean, of the British Labour Party. I'm sorry, they've left Europe. I don't know. They're just a floating island of nothing now. But and we saw what the same strategy accomplished. I mean, this is the thing about this with me is I'm like, we literally since we've seen both increasing crisis of capital since profitability rates dropped. And this is one thing that is blowing my mind right now, Nadim. The amount of socialists who say there is no decline in profitability.
I mean, that's not even, people get that so wrong. They think that it's like a term that Marx invented. Which
no,
it's an empirical term. You can actually prove that it exists. You can see that on national borders for sure, 100%. And there are even researchers right now that show that even on a global scale, that kind of works out. The only thing that Marx brought was a specific argument, basically. Right. Now one could go into discussion whether this holds or not. That's another question, but that the thing exists is clear.
Right. I mean, and it's talked about in any society that uses money. I was reading Ibn Khaldun. I'm being serious about this, and he mentions that profits decline over time.
Sure, of course.
Like that markets stagnate and decline, and thus, like, that's part of his theory of civilizational decline and renewal. And this is, what, 500 years before Marx? Like,
right.
it's not. And it's interesting to me why people deny it, because the denial seems to become, it originally came out of Keynesianism, but now it's spread to other forms of even Marxism.
Right.
And I get why you would deny, for example, that like the Grossmanite thesis that the collapse of capital will necessarily lead to a revolution, because we just don't have a lot of evidence for that.
Mm-hmm.
But the funny thing I pointed out is, like, other than that element of Grossman and the fact that people didn't see capital changing phases, right? Which I think we can talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Grossman's predictions weren't wrong. He
No.
did predict what was going on in the Great Depression. Like,
Right. I mean, yeah. Like we like half the planet was destroyed or something, and then
yeah, and like the only thing that saved that is a war, and the reason why that war can't happen now is nuclear weapons. I mean, that's just another, like, the existential cost of that's even too great for capital.
I think with this what's the name for this thesis that if things go worse, get worse, then there will be a revolution or something? What's it called?
There's two names.
Immiseration.
Immiserationism, and then there's accelerationism, which is
accelerationism. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But the immiseration thesis, I think, I mean, in general, I think you can probably say that, you know, when people get into a worse living situation, they will be more prone to get up for something. But I think the big mistake that communists made and still do is to equate that, you know, with the fact that they will get up for communism. It doesn't have to be at all, you know, and that's where I think that's again where I think we are at right now. We need to teach people to get up in that moment for communism and not for something else. And also, it's not only teaching them, but it's also making them aware of what kind of ideology they're blinded with, and what kind of ideas about, you know, how the world should work and what the nature of the human is, supposedly according to capitalism, such that maybe in these moments we can actually take power.
Well, this is interesting, because what I get when I talk about, for example, the difference between, say, Europe and the United States, and I get told that the midterm elections prove that the American youth are culturally liberal and they will never flip and become like the youth of France right now, which are very conservative, very reactionary. And I'm like, recreate the conditions of France in the United States, and I think you'd see it happen very quickly. And by the way, that is what you are doing. The electoral strategy you are pursuing, which is holding up some centrist who can't really do anything, and whose primary voting base is just fear of an increasingly large right, that you can narrowly defeat.
Right.
Actually, in the case of the United States, narrowly not lose to as bad as you predicted. You know, I mean, the midterms being called a success is only because Democrats in the last generation and a half usually just get creamed. But then I'm like, I thought we didn't think the Democrats were our party. In fact, I thought we didn't think we had a party in the United States. We didn't have a workers' party. We don't even have a reformist labor party or a labor party of capital.
Right.
Like we don't have that. We have different sectoral bourgeois parties, and frankly, the Democrats are weird because they're almost a proto-bourgeois party. They're, you know, they're I think I've been told they're the longest standing voter base electoral party on the planet. And so it's just like, and I think it's funny because everyone thinks I'm like, no, it's you don't have parties that are voter based before them, and they're older than the Republicans. And like the reason why the British parties don't count is they weren't voter based; they were just parliamentary factions. But you're telling me that's a labor party? It like we weren't even in fully capitalist conditions when it was formed.
Are they really claiming that it can be a labor party, or that they want to turn it to a labor party or something?
It actually, yes, there are people who think that because of with the abandonment of the Ackerman plan, there's people like Socialist Majority, which are factions with the DSA, who think that you could transform the Democrats into a workers' party.
I always thought that their theory or their tactics was go in there, make some politics, and then split off and build your own thing.
So there's two major theories. There's what's called the classic Carringtonite thesis, which is what I just said, and then there was the Ackerman plan made by Seth Ackerman. Okay. Ackerman has abandoned the Ackerman plan. They no longer have a plan. The dirty break is the dirty break is over.
So Fukuyama a little bit, kind of.
Yeah, a little bit. Like, and what I find hilarious about it, it wasn't even like Trump that made him do it. It was, well, we don't want Trump back again. I'm like, but you came up with this plan under Trump. Like
he abandoned it because he's he's worried that if he continues
the right so and I'm like, so you have proven the thesis that we are doing popular front tactics to save the Democratic Party. And I used to say this to Michael Brooks when he was alive, and it actually got me in trouble eventually. But I would tell Michael, like, what do you think when you think you'll break in a way that won't risk right-wing reaction, because you say we can't do it when we're going to risk right-wing reaction? When do you think you're going to be able to break with the Democrats? When will there not be possible right-wing reaction? And I would never get an answer. And I'm like, so you're not going to do it? Like, logically, the structural logic of what you just spelled out says you at some level know there is no real trigger point where the trigger point that you have set for when it is okay to make the break is ever going to happen under current conditions.
Unless it's something fantastical, like you I don't know, the Democrats get 90% of the votes, and then you split out, and then
they're like they beat the Republicans so thoroughly in all the states that that there's only one party, and then you can break off. And that's
right.
I want to point out that in no country on the planet under parliamentary conditions, and I will asterisk, the United States is not really under parliamentary conditions, but in this we are the same. Is that the trend right now? The trend is the opposite. The trend is like, it's not like we're the only country that has increasingly highly polarized,
right?
Yeah, politics. That it's everywhere. Like the exceptions are like Russia and China, and we know why they're the exceptions.
Yeah, that's like ultimately polarized, let's say.
Right. So and I find that amazing that we're in this moment, and I want to talk about maybe with the situation in Europe a little bit, particularly in Germany, because Americans got super excited. Admittedly, one of the interesting things about the DSA is the American left has always taken its cues from the European left forever. We had like little brother syndrome. Now we kind of don't. Like, we don't really give a shit about y'all anymore. It's like we're, other than like talking about like, wouldn't it be nice to be Sweden, but or Norway or Denmark? And I'm like, but we're not Sweden or Norway or Denmark. Like we have cities that are larger than that.
Slowly, these states tipping towards the reactionary, and especially Denmark. You wouldn't want to identify with that, maybe. If you're
Denmark and Sweden, like
Sweden too, yeah, for sure.
It's just like, so you're claiming, you're like, you want Nordic social democracy at a time where the Nordics are abandoning it. It's like, like, what are you on? Like,
right. And they too are not abandoning it because they just got another idea, right? Because they have to do something in order to establish their competitive power in the market.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
So let's talk about the SPD and the Greens. Like,
I mean, what we can see now is really with the war that started in February. And I must say it's like a deja vu, because if you go back to the 90s, we actually had this kind of unmasking moment, but most young people today are not old enough to remember that when they went to split up Yugoslavia and basically started the war there. The Greens already were the guys who, who went all out on this, even though they started as a Green Party, as an anti-establishment party, as an somehow anti-capitalist, but never really Marxist, more like, ecological movement kind of party, system change party. In the very first years, they were quite subversive. Most of their actors, politicians, were activists, punks, people that held up houses. Even Joschka Fischer was one of those guys. Most people might know this guy. He's a bit older now, but he was very, very important for the Greens. And he was a squatter. So he squatted in the house when he started in the party. And then in the 90s already, for some reason, and not at all contradictive, I would argue, they turned complete war hawks. And this is again what we see now. So from the SPD, I think, and from the CDU, no one would be really surprised to see them react in that way. But with the Greens, what's happening now is interesting. So there are some people on the left that are completely shocked and surprised and try to figure out why the Greens reacted this way. Some others, like me, and I must say, yeah, most better analysts kind of would have predicted that. The Greens themselves, especially the young ones, are kind of taken by this bellicist, statist, war hawk policy that we are driving right now, and that is interesting in the moment when you go back to the very beginning and you try to realize how they started out and what their goals were, and that some people today even still allude to these goals and think that this is still the strategy of this party, and how it turned out. There is no, basically right now there is no louder party calling for war, calling for delivery of weapons, calling for increasing the efforts to destabilize and attack Russia. That's the Greens, right? And I mean the SPD. If you talk about the SPD, their revolutionary expectations, or their revolutionary expectations of people towards them, they were gone since 50 years. No one is talking about the SPD in that way anymore, so no one is really surprised. But I think that's a good example for people to look at. Were they as revolutionary as you can get? I think they were 10 times more revolutionary as people are from the DSA. They understood more about the situation.
Absolutely.
And they went in there, and it's not even that they got co-opted. I wouldn't, there's this argument that the state will just wash you clean and co-opt you, and you will just be the slave of the state as a politician. I don't think that's the case. I think because of their wrong analysis, because of their wrong ideas, what the state actually is, what the party is, what capitalism is, what money is, all of these theoretical problems that we discussed in the beginning, because of that, the logical conclusion for them was to say that we now need to go to Yugoslavia, bomb Yugoslavia, in order to, I don't know, stop the next Auschwitz or something like this, he said back then.
Yeah, this is what I mean, one, I think this is a just general failure of Marxists to deal with the reality of geopolitics, and say something like, I am vastly unpopular with both sides of this argument, just like I was with Syria, for saying stuff like, I don't know the conditions of which this war end. I don't have good conditions for them. But what NATO is doing is barbaric, and also Russia started the war. So what do you do? What I can tell you don't do is become a fucking NATO cheerleader.
You don't. I mean, the first thing you have to realize is that this is a game. I mean, realize from the first moment on that you don't even understand in February what happened. You don't even know why Russia started this. You had to go to the fucking news to find out what happened. And then you were like, oh, 8 years of battles since 2014. What happened in Crimea? Most people maybe didn't follow that also, or forgot or something. Okay, so the first thing is, this is not your game. This is the game of some states that carve up their interest against each other. That's what happened there. That's the first. So don't take sides. This is not about you taking. If you are identifying yourself with your state and your nation, and you talk about us when you say USA, or you talk about us when you say Germany, okay, then you can say, I know I'm taking a side here. But as communists, we're not doing that.
No,
right?
But here's the thing. Which faction of communists right now does internationalism have any meaning other than occasionally going to another country who isn't communist and overseeing their elections as standoffs, which is also something the far right does, by the way. I mean, it's just, it's a meaningless gesture.
It's solidarity. Yeah, it's virtue signaling. That's what it is.
Right. I mean,
all these Instagram posts about solidarity with XYZ. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah. The question would be, I think the question for the solidarity thing would be, why is it even necessary for there to be solidarity in the first place? Ask yourself that. And then, I mean, if you go down that rabbit hole, you'll realize quickly that, all these statements and taking sides with some fighters somewhere in the jungle because they will maybe hurt imperialism in some way. I heard, like, I don't know that there is much around of this, but I heard some YouTubers out there that basically bring up the thesis that we should support Russia, even though we know it's bad and
it is.
The guy even said it's proto-fascist and blah blah blah. I'm not saying that, but let's say it's really, really bad. It's morally reprehensible, but we should still support it because it's hurting the main empire.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically recapitulating the logic of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Mm-hmm.
Look how well that worked out.
I mean, it's also, it comes, I mean, Marxist-Leninism in the 60s, 70s had that as their tactics, right? To support the national liberation movements in Africa and the Middle East. Even send them weapons, send them money.
Slightly more sense, though. Like, who's the National Liberationary Party in this conflict?
Yeah, true. It made slightly more sense.
Yeah. I mean, it's, yeah. Look, my damning thing is, and I think this is going to upset people. I think national self-determination is a contradiction for Marxists that we've never been able to wrap our head around, going all the way back.
Right.
That we're supposed to be internationalist. We saw in the context of late feudal, post-feudal empires that were just hanging on in the development of capitalism, and like places where literally the bourgeois revolutions weren't finished. Like, I can kind of see the stagist logic there. And I can see it in the idea that you want to fight off capitalist powers in the developing world, and stop unilateral, not even exploitation, this pure extraction. But okay, and I get that.
But these are, yeah.
But that's not the goal of communism.
No, that's also moral. That's all moral categories. We have to go again. Like, of course, it's bad that, I don't know, Vietnam gets bombed into ashes and millions of people get killed in all these wars, etc. And we want to be opposed to that. That's not the question, right? We have an analysis that even explains why these fucking things happen all the time.
And at least in that case, you had Vietnam. The Viet Cong were at least expressing an interest in developing socialism. So it's like, I'm like, that at least made some sense. And yeah, I mean, I think the fall of the Soviet Union is a world historical tragedy. I think the Sino-Soviet split is actually probably an even bigger world historical tragedy. But you know what's funny about that? I don't think any of those societies were actually communist, and I know that
of course
people
not.
off.
Of course not. I would even say they didn't. I would even say they didn't fall; they were dismounted.
Right. I mean, and I would even, in the Soviet Union, I'm not sure what it was. Parts of it were capitalist, parts of it actually don't make sense under capitalist logic. I've never been able to figure out. But with China, I'm like, no, since like 1976, that's been a capitalist developmentalist state.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's like, I don't see how that's different than like what Perón tried to do in Argentina, are even what the fucking British Crown tried to do with its government sponsored companies. I don't see how that's different. Like, and oh, that'll piss people off. But
that's
true.
the other big category that none of them really gets right, which is the nation. What's the nation state, and like what's nationalism? And I mean, ultimately, what people now going on the streets here protesting, they are doing that in the name of the nation. You know, they're calling onto the nation state to help us as a German nation. Some of our leftists, let's say, okay, the more reactionary side of our leftist spectrum, they are condemning the war on Russia in Ukraine. Sorry, the war on Russia is said wrong. The war with Russia in Ukraine. They're condemning it on the basis that it's bad for our national capitalist interests. Right. Yeah, well, if you take that stance, you already say where you're standing regarding the nation itself.
When I was a paleo-conservative, I said the same. And for those of you who don't know what that means, when I was like a neoliberal conservative in my 20s, I said exactly that about the Iraq War. Like I know what that logic is because I come from it, and I see it in social democrats and even people who claim to be more radical than that all the time.
Yeah, all the time.
And they don't recognize it in themselves.
It's completely ingrained, but it's also, I mean, it's part of our school teachings. It's how we come up. I mean, that's the fucking World Cup right now, right? I mean,
right? Yeah, it's everywhere. And but the thing is, you have to ask yourself the question: why is it everywhere? Why is it so useful? Because nationalism is, as I was saying to a more reactionary friend, nationalism is useful if you're, I don't know, Poland and the Germans are on your borders, but it tends to be as soon as the Germans go away, not all that useful anymore. Like it's good for fighting occupiers, and uniting to occupy. But
I don't know. I think there are probably different forms of nationalisms.
Oh yeah,
because I mean, in Germany we don't have this kind of, you know, I mean, we do have a lot. Sorry, I'm not saying we don't have it, but it's not the dominant form of nationalism, which is this extreme exclusionary and hateful, you know, towards others kind of nationalism. But this idea of identifying yourself with the interest of your state, right? Mm-hmm. This is completely ingrained in everyone, and for me, that's already the birth of nationalism.
Yeah,
because then that turns also to fascism, because once that state, you know, does all the things that it's supposed to do in your view, but it doesn't turn out so good for yourself, and you look around you and everybody else is also you know, barely surviving, then it's easy to find someone, or many times the states, or not actually always, the state also helps with that, finding someone inside of your society who is responsible for that shit. And that's I think where it turns to that, you know, fascist or completely exclusionary streak, where you're saying like, okay, we want those people out, or we want to kill those people or something.
Right. I think.
But it's all built on. That's why I also reject the idea that fascism is something different than from bourgeois democracy. For me, it's like it's on an evolutionary scale of the bourgeois democracy. And it can happen again, while at the same time I would not say, you know, we are in any way close to it. We're not in those conditions. And they also have different, by now that there are different mechanisms, much more evolved mechanisms to maintain this kind of control and structure that the state needs.
Right. I was supposed to say the United States actually its state power is actually hampered by fascistic development, despite the fact that people, like, we do have a what I would echo Enzo Traverso in calling a post-fascist. I don't think it's the same. The conditions aren't the same, but
no.
I also do think it rhymes. There are people in like West Virginia that think they are the German conservative reactionaries coming back from the hinterlands because they feel embattled, but they're embattled in their heads, because conditions are bad and they're being shamed for that. But but I like to remind people, but that's not the same as actually fighting in the fucking Sudetenland. So
no, but it is the same. It is the same as, like, that's the national thought. That's the national idea. You are identifying yourself with a greater good that your state or your nation is supposed to install. And if it doesn't happen the way that you think it should happen, then okay, it's on you. It's your duty for your nation to go up there and change that, identify the enemy, and maybe, I don't know, do horrible things there. I think for me that's a continuum.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that's also what we don't know on the left anymore. Like, people on the left don't.
I went so far with this, and I know you've actually been a fan of me for longer than I've been a fan of you, because I've done this for longer.
Oh yeah,
but
I've been a fan of you since VarnVlog started.
Yeah,
VarnVlog started,
yeah,
at least.
Yeah. But if you go back in my archives, like real far back to 2016, 2017, and listen to Diet Soap, you'll hear me talking about what I was worried about then, which I was worried that since the DSA had been the form of left renewal in the United States, and that we'd also seen pushed in left-wing media, all the way across the board, and I'll name names here, all the way from Doug Henwood to your standard thing of The Nation. I mean, even The Nation. Like, it's in the fucking name. And I'm like, look, when we talk about national sovereignty and national identity in the European context, we actually, in American English, we mean ethnicity. But the nation state in both areas is pretty much the same thing. And we've been engaged in a nation building project in America for a long time. The reason why we have weird concepts like whiteness or whatever is because our nation building project has never really completely took on. So we've had to use other identity categories to maintain it, borrowed from weird shit that Europeans did to justify their slave trade when they moved from justifying it off of religious grounds to justifying it off something else. And yes, it's part of a settler colonial project. That's all true. That's not my point here. But my worry then in 2017 was, I see methodological nationalism everywhere. I don't think it'll just stay methodological, because I'd seen that happen with Marxists before. Like, in my life, when Marxists were more radical, and one of the sad truths about the movement of the Overton window in America is that we made socialism popular by not talking about what it is, and not defining it at all. So people think that socialism is what right wingers said it is, which is any social good, and I'm like, capitalism has always provided social goods,
right?
Yeah, it has to. And it's always done this because you can never meet social reproduction without it. And they realize this even in the ordo-liberal capitalism, which didn't even have a fully developed welfare state. They saw what it did. They had 40% of during what in England called the Regency period, the period of high imperial capitalism, when it's really developing in the beginnings of industrialization, 40% of women were sex workers. You can't maintain a society off that. They know that. That's the kind of thing. And I know I'm gonna get people yelling at me because they're gonna hear I'm anti-sex work, and I don't want to. That's not my point.
Oh, okay. That's a hot topic. Yeah, we shouldn't go there.
Yeah. But 40% of those women were sex workers in England during this time period. You can't meet social reproduction stability with that, and they knew that. So there
was an interesting discussion. Just another example. There was an interesting discussion. I just read about that, and I think it was in the 90s, end of the 90s, and it was in Great Britain. And there was the situation that the state was starting to discuss to, I don't know, send Jamie Oliver or someone into the schools in order to teach people to eat properly and cook properly.
Right.
Because people overall were getting more obese. They were starting to turn out smaller than they used to. Like English people are shrinking basically and getting fatter and fatter.
They look more and more like Americans.
and hence they they will be less productive. They'll die early. They be sick. They maybe won't be good military assets, etc. So the state cares about this shit, and
No,
I mean
really
it's not because they are good people that they care about this shit.
The presidential health challenge isn't because they just want you to feel spry and self-fulfill your own needs. Like, it's because they need able-bodied people, and
right. And now this is a good example. Now you could say as a leftist, well, but still, it's great that Jamie Oliver goes to all the schools and teaches us how to eat well, because then we eat better after all, right? And then we won't be as fat anymore, right?
Except that that's not what's happening at all.
But even if that were happening,
okay,
I'm saying that even on a principle base,
okay,
even if that were happening, that's a means of rule. That's how they rule. That's how they control society. You should be against that. You should not in content. You don't have to like be angry at Jamie Oliver or tell people not to eat better. But you should realize what that is and fight it. And that's not happening anymore.
That's the marginal leftist response. So often is not what is not realizing the first thing, but then like, okay, woke capitalism is a problem. Now, wokeism is a vague term. I don't really know what it means. I don't know why we're borrowing. I mean, that's a weird term because it has very specific meanings in the Black community. It's inappropriated by the right, and then we reappropriate it for some reason. But let's talk about like woke capitalism. And so you have people who flip that and like, we need to support national capital or productive capital. And I'm like, no, we don't need to support capital at all. This is about, and the reason why, these cultural products are quote woke is because they need to expand their market share. It wasn't because of the goodness in everyone's fucking heart. Maybe there is also a branding element of it where you can say, well, we've moved from, I don't know, taste as distinction to meritocracy as distinction to morality as distinction. And that is a different ideological justification for rule. Right. And for the kinds of distinctions you set up in class and why businesses do what they do. And I think there's maybe some truth to that, but just trying to like, I don't know, let's go back to 1940s reindustrial industry. And I'm like, why? We don't even need to. You just want to do that quote for jobs, I guess, but like it's not necessary anymore. Like the United States, and a lot of people in the US don't get this. The United States is still really industrially productive. It just doesn't require a lot of people in the specific fields to do it. Like it's still the second or third, depending on the year. Now we're the second. Actually, we may even be the first soon because China's slowing down so much. Industrial productive society in the planet. We don't hire anyone in it, not like Germany or definitely not like China, but like we're still doing it. And and you're only looking at this in terms of nations. If you look at this in terms of capital flows, you will see that we're all integrated.
Of course. Yes.
Right. Which is why I never took this whole like, oh, Russia's going to cause like BRICS to decouple and they're not. I'm like, that's idiotic. Like,
but then again, at the same time, we can see that even like when the interest of the nation state gets, gets tampered with that much, and I'm not only talking about Russia, but I'm talking also about the West and the NATO states' interests in the area, that they can also go against the capital interest, which they are doing now, at least in Germany. Right, so that's also an important learning, but yeah, I think that comes again back to that first point that we talked about if your goal is to make people eat healthier in Britain so they don't become as fat and taller and look nicer and are healthier, if that is what you're trying to achieve, you basically make yourself the political consultant of the state. A left-wing political consultant, fair enough. You give them some ideas on how they could do it better. You don't fundamentally criticize the state as an institution that you don't want. if you, on the other hand, come from a perspective where you want to remove that rule, then you will maybe also embrace Jamie Oliver going to those schools and people eating healthier, but you'll do it for some tactical reason. You'll have something in mind why you're doing this, and you want to do something with it after. And that's also the thing that, you know, with leftists, I mean, you have established this now. We don't have. Okay, so you want to do step A now. Okay, what's step B? Tell me, what's your plan? And what's step C? What do you do then? And if B doesn't work, what's B sharp? What do we then do then? You know, and they don't have that. So that's why I say, back to the books, guys.
Yeah. Yeah,
I mean, it's chapter 8, capital 1, I think, where he talks about how the state had to introduce himself in order to, you know, deal with wage negotiations and wage problems and blah blah blah. Yeah. We need to understand this.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely I think that's absolutely true, and I think it's. And I think there are elements of Marxism that we need to work out that are not fully worked out, but most of it begins in capital, there's a surplus value, and the Goethe critique. And then in the actual life of Marx and Engels. That's how I feel. Like because there are, if like you read all the letters, there are places where like Marx changes his opinion. He's in a immiseration thesis, right. Or he seems to be in an immiseration thesis person in the 1850s and the 1860s. He doesn't seem to be, and stuff like that. But all that stuff does not actually change the fundamentals of particularly Capital Volume 1, but all 3 volumes. Is everything that we deal with in there? No, there have been changes in money. I will totally admit that. There have been, but the funny thing is the changes in money haven't changed the way money functions. That's as a class moderator, it changes whether or not it's the international market court in metal are great state power fiats that do it, but that it doesn't really change the actual function. And
Marx already envisioned fiat money, by the way. I mean, it was not something that was out of the question.
No, he mentions it in the Grundrisse. I'm going to mispronounce that.
And also at the same time, we are decoupled from gold, but once the stock market crashes, let's see what happens. I mean, let's take that easy, I would say. But there is another thing. Okay, maybe he didn't. Okay, so first point, money is maybe different, but that's a form question. So Marx makes it very, very clear that he's trying to analyze the underlying laws of this system and not its form. And he's talking about, the ideal average of how this system works. And of course, every system then will work differently and also historically different. But there might be things that he didn't take care of, right? For example, the state, for example, imperialism. These are things that he just wanted to do, but he didn't get to. I mean, of course, he also wrote about them. And we have an idea what he would get to. But, well, then what would the project be? If we say, okay, capital gives us the idea that we need, but we don't have everything that we need, well, then we need to fricking go and research that and write it down and complete his work. Why can't we do that? Why are we not even taking this as a plan for us as communists to? I mean, some people did, to be clear, all right? It's not that nobody did.
Yeah, there are people who've tried. Most of them
nobody reads them.
Right.
Nobody cares about it. The state, we take for granted, leftists today take for granted what the bourgeois liberal democracy tells us about the state. We think that the state is what they tell us the state is. It's a pluralist tool that we can just win votes and then we can tilt it to our interest.
Which I find hilarious to me, and this isn't just the cooperation thesis, but I've always been like, then why do votes not represent popular opinion in it ever in any society? Because it's never been the point.
There is even a law in Germany. I don't know how this is in the US, but I also recently just found this out. There's a law that basically forbids. I mean, let's say Party X promises something, I don't know, to raise taxes or lower taxes. Then they get into power, they don't lower taxes. Now, theoretically, you could sue them for lying because they got your vote on this basis. No, there is a law that explicitly states that this kind of binding vote of, I vote for you because you are supposed to do X is forbidden in our democracy. That's not what this is for. The voting mechanism is not there to vote someone into the parliament for him to do what you want or be a little bit closer to what you want. That's not what it's for. The voting is there for the government affirm every 4 years in Germany that they can do what they want, and they want to know that from you. They want you to agree to that situation, that they are in power and they rule. They want to sign that. They want you to sign that with your X on the voting ballot, right? So if you think of voting that way, then it also you are not surprised anymore why they don't do what you want them to do, right? Why they lie all the time. I mean, it's not even lying by this point. Everybody knows this, right? Everybody knows that every politician lies, and what they say before the vote doesn't go after the vote. Like who really believes that there are politicians that are not, having some other games there? Nobody. Everybody knows. So what is this voting thing actually? Nobody is asking that. And every 4 years they are then rallying again for the, in your case for the Democrats, here for the left party maybe, or for the Greens or whatever. And if it doesn't work because they don't have any arguments for it, they go with the right scare. And they say, yeah, look, if you don't vote for them, you vote for the right.
Yeah, and ironically in America, this is actually incentivizing some really perverse shit. So, for example, I do not believe for a moment Roe v. Wade will be reinstantiated at the federal level in the United States. Why? Because the Democrats just used it to maintain their power. If they give it to you, they lose it. And by the way, that's why the right had never done it before.
Right.
Like,
right.
It's literally the same structural logic. The right never they never legislatively intended for them to actually deliver on it. And the ones that did, like say Lindsey Graham, immediately get shamed by people like Mitch McConnell for being like, no, you idiot, we don't really want to give them that, even if we agree with it, because we'll lose it as a sort of Damocles to hang over liberals' heads, and as a carrot for conservative voters. Right. The question should be, and even I get confused by this when I listen to like analysis, particularly from the left in America. You forget that that's not your goal. You're like, okay, well, yes, we fought off the right. And then I'm like, but I care about that, but I also don't. Like, I know it's a strange thing to say. Like, I do care about it. There are bourgeois rulers who are worse than other bourgeois rulers. Although I don't know that it's consistently a DRR problem.
No, I think everybody should be concerned about that. You can be. Maybe you have some power to change that with some vote, but this is not the communist fucking project. This is not what this is about.
This is something epiphenomenal that we do because we are stuck in a nation state, not because we believe the nation state will be the ultimate way in which we get our real. Which, by the way, if the nation state has to compete on the capitalist market, it won't. And people are like, oh, well, how does it ever happen? I'm like, well, the whole world was not capitalist nation states. And I mean, I guess there's still a few holdouts. But functionally not really.
Yeah.
They're just capitalist nation states aren't democratic. But the whole world was not capitalist nation states until very recently.
Right.
Like, and it's funny because I hear things, and your German listeners may get a kick out of this. I hear things from Americans who are like, well, but the German culture and the German nation is so old. And I'm like, no, fucking isn't. Like, okay. Like, they're like, well, it's just our government that's older than Germany. I'm like, no, our settler colonial project is older than the idea of a unified German nation.
That's them naturalizing what the nation is, as if the nation goes back 2,000 years. And because, those guys who fought the Romans maybe spoke something that remotely had like 2 or 3 German words in it.
Right. So
they
like,
have to be Germans too,
The Alemanni and the Visigoths are Germans.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Like, Yeah, and like the Romani, excuse me, not the Romani, the Romanians are Dacians, and I guess the Tuscans are Etruscans, but that fucks up that analogy, so we're not gonna go there. I mean, and yeah, there are definitely communists who do this. There are communists who do it even for other nation states. I mean, because how many communists have told me? I've had communists literally tell me, all right, these are not the Social Democrats, that Chinese culture is unique in its ability to have communism because it's a consistent culture for 6,000 years, and Confucianism paves the way for communism. And I'm like, what the blue fuck is that?
I mean, it's just openly racist at that point. I mean,
like, it's just like, but it doesn't use Western race categories. So you have like, yes, I understand. Maybe
yeah, an old nation. Yes.
Yeah, I'm like,
they didn't conquer. They don't have different people there. No.
It's not.
Yeah.
Like
they all look the same, no, right?
Yeah, Chinese civic nationalism doesn't even it's not even Han nationalism. It's like it's a nationalism of a bunch of different peoples. But
nationalism is a freaking contradiction all the way down to, I don't know, the house that you live in compared to the house next to you. I mean, this is it's an ideology,
right? Well, this is what I was talking about national liberation, and I was like, so the left should be for national liberation, and if I decide that my neighborhood is a nation because we have certain cultural habits that we've done forever, and
you might, right? It might be.
In certain areas of Europe in particular, for sure, a real possibility. Like,
look, I'm from Palestine, right? In Palestine, every village has a different accent.
Right.
They cook different kinds of food. I mean, similar foods, but some kind of different foods and stuff. I mean,
that leads to like stuff in America. Like there's this weird theory that liberals like that I find kind of racist of the 6 nations in the United States, and they're all based on like what ethnic group origin you're from. So like there's the Tidewater, and they're Scotch Irish, and there's New England, and they're English, and there's the West Coast, which is the English people who left, and then there's like the Southwest, which is a mixture of like Scotch Irish people, and I'm like, how's this not weird racial essentialism? That like goes back and like, well, there's this X category, and this is how Scotch Irish people act, going back 5,000 years to Europe, and I'm like, Scotch Irish people want a fucking category for 5,000 years. Like,
it's also deeply manipulative approach to this, right? So you are assuming from the very beginning that people do not understand. They cannot understand with their mind what you're telling them, but that you have to somehow, look for their specific factors, or how they were brought up, and the way that they talk, and their slang, etc., and then dial into this in order to manipulate them to do what you think is right as a communist leader or something like that. So where I think, like, no, I think the argument should be sound for everyone. And if we tell the argument to a Chinese person, or I don't know, a Han person, or some Korean person, or a Palestinian person, or an American person, it needs to make sense. And of course we will not convince everybody, but that should be the goal. And the only reason, I mean, internationalism is great, and I think we should, of course, I mean, as I said, we are doing also a lot of international stuff, but mostly, to be honest, mostly for education, not for virtue signaling in the sense of, okay, yeah, let's say free Palestine in every episode. That's not what I care about so much. It's more about like, what do we understand about the world system through looking at what's happening in Israel and Palestine right now. Right? So
I mean, this is my point too. I'm like, I don't educate you about what's going on in Peru or Brazil or Palestine or Europe so that you can change what's going on in Peru or Brazil or Palestine or Europe. Because one, you don't have the power to change your government's policy towards it. You just don't. Like, don't lie to yourself. And two, like, I mean, even if you did, like, even if, like, say we took over the United States and we just pulled back all of our money, and like we no longer support Israel as a defense, which, by the way, that is now that increasingly over time, for not reasons of anti-Semitism, even for reasons of change of geostrategic orientation and importance, could easily happen.
It's going to happen in the next 20, 30 years unless something big changes. The trajectory is clear now.
Trajectory is clear that like Israel's gonna putty up with Russia eventually, and we're not going to give a shit. Like, and the situation with the Arab states and Israel is really fluid, because while they need it for the domestic populations, clearly Saudi Arabia and or Egypt don't actually give a shit. Like,
never did, yeah.
Right. And we have no evidence that they ever did. Like, it's a cudgel. And I feel like we get stuck in these policies because we do have to deal with ethnic conflicts. And one of the things I say in the communism is we don't have a good answer for that yet, admittedly. I mean, I think once you start the dismantling the nation state, some of the worst elements of it go away. But like the national question has been the question that like communists get themselves tied in knots about, and about what to do. Not, I mean, you think about Soviet policy where they're creating nations so people can modernize, but also like that leads to anti-Soviet sentiment because the Soviets are seen as the Russians, and like
but they also, I mean, there I must say I would also disagree with them, because they made also an error of, at least maybe for tactical or strategical reasons, but clearly in their actions to affirm the nation state as something they want and not something that is to be overcome. And they did that even in their policy of national sovereignty, where the idea was, okay, we can't force them to join the Soviet Union. Then, okay, we have to tell them, at least become socialist. You can be your own little nation, but you have to be it. You have to join us on your own free will. Fair enough. But that already presupposes that there is no revolutionary class consciousness in these nations for them to want their own nation. So maybe then the work should have been, if it were even possible. I'm not saying they could have done that or something. I mean, there were so many other factors playing into it. But then it's again back to, okay, let's talk about what that nation is. Let's do some education on this, and let's try to understand everybody that we need to get rid of it.
Well, I mean, this has been a problem, and I think this is a problem going back a long time. And where two things that Marxists do, we're not theoretically totally against the state completely, but we are totally against the nation state. That's actually explicit. The reason why we're not anarchists is the whole transition down part of the state element of that. And that's because the dictatorship of the proletariat is kind of still a state. But once you've achieved that, that's not the goal, by the way. Like the goal,
that's how it starts.
That's how you start it. That's how you safeguard it to happen.
Right.
But our goal is not to administer a giant state that fights other states in some grand socialist republic. And yes, there are elements of republicanism you can find in Engels. It's there. But I've actually been confused on this issue forever, because Marx and Engels actually aren't even that consistent on it.
Well, it's also easy from a principled standpoint to just judge this, because obviously they were also facing a hostile power that they were also establishing them as this nation from the hostile influence that they gave. They had to fight. I mean, let's not say, maybe I revert what I said before, the term judge is maybe wrong, but I think even if you go into the writings, you go to Lenin, you go to Bukharin, all these people, you see theoretical errors there where the nation state is being affirmed as something that should stay. And that's ultimately, I think, also why the Soviet Union turned out the way that it turned out. And why it didn't become a classless society, even though it might have been a capitalist society.
Well, I mean, this is the whole logic of this becomes very clear when you see what happens with it, right? So you promote these states, you also try to abolish class relations. You don't totally succeed at that. You realize that the state interest actually can lead to development that's not in anyone's interest, and since you're pitting states against states, you can accidentally do something like, I don't know, the homolador or something, which is not. I think read the general scholarly consensus outside of what people say, was not a deliberate genocide, but it's a state policy fuck up, of epic proportions that would not happen if you weren't having one nation state needing the resources of another and seeing it as two completely separate administrative issues. And so these are the kinds of problems that you get into. And when communists go to nation build, I'm confused, because that is the same argument as communists building capitalism so that we can have socialism, which is something that maybe from the standpoint of productive forces, I could even understand more. I don't know that I think it was wise, but I get it. Whereas with building nation states as administrative districts, I'm like, you're literally setting up, you're going to have to take power away from these states that you just established. How are they going to feel about that when you've told them that their national identity as a nation, not as a culture, as a nation, is important?
Right. And I just want to say one more thing that just came to my mind, because how this started was you saying that people would answer to your arguments. They would answer with, oh, yeah, but then how is it ever going to happen? Mm-hmm. Right. And to that, I would just want to say that's not an argument. Like, it's not. You're not actually saying anything there. You're not saying the critique is wrong. You're not saying the argument is wrong. We might, I mean, maybe we have an answer how it could happen. We might also not know how it will happen or if it will happen. That doesn't make the critique wrong. It doesn't make wrong what we just said about the state, about the nation, about money, about all the stuff. So this is the first, I mean, that's many times that's the reaction that communists get when they talk to liberals, right? Okay, but what's the alternative to capitalism? That's the best thing we have, right? That's, I mean, anybody who has discussed this topic gets this, right? Yep, this is a sign of people rejecting the critique. It's not really people saying, oh, but not, okay, let's go, let's do the alternative. No, they're saying, I don't believe your critique. So that means your work isn't finished. You still have to keep teaching.
Right. Probably. Well, this is something I really think about a lot, because it also, it's based on a couple of things. One, the naturalization of current conditions of the nation state, of capital, going back in historical epochs that, if you are aware of how they worked, cannot be true. There's a reason why capitalists always love mining Aristotle for making it look like Greek city-states work capitalistically, even though they clearly did not. There's also movements on the left because of vagaries around things like mode of production, which I will admit are vague and many times very vulgar. And Marx, he didn't work them all out. Who just go, well, we need to drop the idea of difference. And but then how do you explain that, for example, manorial or feudal societies in Europe, and you can use whatever you want to talk about, you can use whatever fucking word you want, did not produce more than what we can tell by doing modern comparisons to something like 1% economic growth ever. That's the best they ever did. Like, and I'm not saying that economic growth is always good even, but I'm just saying, like, that's, and then after capitalism, 20, 30, 40% growth in the beginning. And what is changing? Well, it's a move from serf labor to, quote, free labor. It's a move from direct extraction to exploitation. It's a move from it's a move to banking. Like yes, banking existed, but banking as part of every economic transaction and kind, and money being used for more than just paying the king their taxes back.
Right.
Like, that's what changes. That's the basic preconditions for capital. Elements of that exist, yes, all over history. You'll find markets, whatever. But those conditions altogether are what defines capitalism, from what you can deduce from Marx and from what you can deduce from history, because you have to explain why there's such an explosive difference. And if you say, oh, well, there's no real difference in means of production because those are all just vagaries that you're imposing on other societies. And yes, they are abstractions. Yes, they're abstract naming categories, but there is a significant change, right?
Sure.
Well, nobody saw that significant change coming. People did argue for it. There were the bourgeois revolutionaries.
No, because it wasn't planned. It happened.
Yeah, it wasn't planned. Right. Yes, there's elements of communism that promises to be more planned. That's part of the point. And to give everyone say in that plan, that's the other part of the point. But And it was a 400-year process, 500-year process at minimum to fully capitalize most of the planet. A very violent process, resisted. I mean, that's why colonialism was so brutal in places like Africa and the Americas. If people could have been easily incorporated, it would have been cheaper to do so, and they would have. But once they extracted raw goods, so it's clear to me that what you see is people saying, well, there is no alternative, but they're also having to say, this has always kind of been true. And what gets me about that is I expect that for conservatives or liberal capitalists. I do not expect that from leftists denying basic facts so that they can say, like, oh, if we have a monetary program or a full employment guarantee or whatever. And the Marxist stance, Marxists have been dealing with this since we've existed. And we would say the reason why you're not going to have a full employment guarantee is the class structure of capitalism will fall apart the moment you do it.
That's the end of capitalism. That's the end of the state. If you manage to do that, like, show me with which tanks you're going to enforce this, please. Let's do it.
Right. Because if I have full employment, there's no way.
And in a meaningful sense, though, right? So not like full employment, like, yeah, I mean, if you don't get a job, you get, I don't know, $400 on your on your monthly bill or something.
Right. But no,
it needs to be something. You are going to now fiscally with a money injection, you are going to completely shut down any kind of competition on the labor market. That's what you've done.
Yeah.
Now let's see what capitalism does with that. By the way, if you do that in one state, I know what capitalists in that state will do. I know what I would do. Just leave the country. Anyway, but I think...
Yeah, that's about it.
Yeah.
So what do you think, we've talked a lot about this. We've been going for 2 hours and we've made our points. We've also probably indirectly insulted a ton of our guests. Who probably don't know that they probably don't even realize we've insulted them.
I'm not speaking in the name of any of my partners at the podcast. I'm just speaking in my name. So
right.
Blame me, please.
I only speak in my name. So I'm not a member of any organization, and I definitely am not speaking for my union at the moment. So
no, I really do think, guys, I think we need to get into our heads that we need to start from scratch on a very fundamental level. And the reason why we should do that with the people around us is not because of nation and, we should help the people in our nation. It's our duty and all this bullshit. No, it's just because it's the only practical thing to do. There's no other way to reach the people, in India, to organize with them. You have to organize with people around you. And in these groups, you have to make sure that all those categories are understood so that people want to burn the place down. If they don't want to do that, you are going to get co-opted. I'm convinced of that.
Well, I mean, this is my point now that I think I'm going to go. I've been worried that we've ceded all the counter-systemic force, which is the fancy Wallerstein word for saying burn the shit down to the right. And we have done that many times in our history. It is not the first time. This is not new.
It's also a reaction to repression, to be clear. I mean, and it's also a part of the ideology soaking into our minds, and us just accepting it.
And we have to build this both horizontally and vertically, and are neither, depending on the framework you want to use. But that's what we have to do. And I think we need to go back. I was thinking the other day, we keep on being shown, and not just in America. Americans think, oh, there's a left in Europe. There's a left somewhere. No, there's no country right now where our kind of left is even a faction of the ruling coalition, except in maybe some states in India and maybe some holdouts in the PRC. Maybe I'm willing to grant that those maybe exist. But in general, on the national level in India, there's no representation. In Europe, there's not that much real representation. When the Communist parties caved in the 70s, it was pretty much over. In Latin America, there's probably some stuff going on that's probably more close to this. But again, does it have power? The moment it takes power, it seems to get in boondoggles and can't even get like reforms that we can get in Europe and the West done. In the American Canada, they can't even get those for various reasons. And just telling them to print more money is not nearly enough.
Well, obviously they can't. Yeah, if they do, I mean, they can, but if they do, they're fucked.
Right? They're not a major. They're not a major production power, and no one's going to buy their shit and thus take their money. I mean,
they're like seven people, 7 countries that can do that, and even they don't do that all the time because they know if they do it all the time, they also are going to have trouble.
Right. I mean, and so like I'm not for people like, oh, Marxists don't believe in the stuff described in the MT. I'm like, that's not the issue we have. No. Like, no. The issue we have is this idea that we're going to be able to use this finagling on the states or whatever to be able to bring about communism, or even I'm beginning to think even a transition, like at all. I just don't think that. And so on that note, we can just say that parliamentarism that we're currently built isn't working. And in fact, I honestly think we might be making things worse. Like, by doing this way, because we are aligning ourselves with an element of the state that has become increasingly unpopular, and people who believed in us during the recessions of 2007, 2008, 2009, at least in my country, and I think it's also true in Europe, no longer believe in us anymore as a counterforce. They think we are. And quite frankly, by our actions, they're not wrong. And that for a communist, that should be an existential crisis.
Yep, agreed.
Like, how, if we are seen as part of the bourgeois establishment, we have totally fucked up. Like, all right. Well, on that note,
yeah. I mean, it's a pessimistic note, but it's important to be realistic. We try to take this scientifically, right? So, just I know everybody wants to have hope, and everybody wants immediate change, but we're in a bad spot. We got to figure that out.
Yeah, and I think I do think, for example, we haven't talked about the electoral prospects in Germany, but the ADF is a lot stronger after the SPD Green coalition than it was before it.
Oh yeah, sure.
Like
the AfD, yes, it's true. I mean, yeah, that's a whole different package, but we can talk about that, the electoral stuff in Germany in another
episode. Yeah, I would worry. I get so excited about this because all the Americans like SPD won. We're back in. I'm like, oh my god. It's just.
I think there was even an article. I don't know where. It wasn't maybe it was in the Nation even, that was headlined "New Socialist Chancellor." That was we sent that around. That was really funny. We laughed a lot.
Oh wow! Is this American publication?
Yeah. It was an American.
Of course we did that. Of course we did that. Yeah, we're so desperate. That's why we're always like talking about frankly losers, and like, come Jeremy Corbyn and Dilma Rousseff and talk to us about how we win socialism, and I'm like, they lost.
Yeah,
they objectively. If you put Yanis Varoufakis on another fucking panel,
well, you can still respect them, but you should say, okay, that's the way not to do it. I'm not gonna ask you how to do it.
What can we learn from your experience is a good question, maybe. But like,
yeah,
like, how do we win? They don't know.
Maybe the right question would be, and that would be an interesting question, exactly, to ask them. Okay, why did you fail? Why do you think you failed?
Why do you think it? Why do you think it? And if I hear, well, it was a right-wing coup.
Yeah. Okay then.
Okay, goodbye. Whatever. Yep. Like,
doesn't help me.
Why did a right-wing coup happen? like What did you not do?
Right.
But you know, yeah. Anyway, on that note, take care.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you guys.
Always. See you.